right? Amazing how I took you all from a focal point of where potentially the trigger could have been something else that someone may have done to you, and it could have been someone else that made you feel a certain way, to now sitting with how I feel, the fear I am going through, the anxiety I am processing in that moment, which leads to a habit that I use. The reason I use the word I so much is because that word I and me was probably conditioned out of us through emotional or spiritual beating when we were children. And to say the focus is on like how we can show up for somebody else, how we can love somebody else, how we can be good people, blah, blah, blah. Never to realize, what am I even fucking going through? What am I hurting from? What do my emotions have to tell me? What does my state of being have to say to me right now? And there is so much power in awareness in itself, because you all now have a bigger answer today than you may have had yesterday, than you may have ever had, on what could be the biggest focal point creating habits. For me, as a therapist, I'm always about the cause. I'm almost never about the mechanism in itself. I've had people come to me, for example, my coping mechanism at one point was sex. And it was my habit to basically try and seek the validation of people, especially like women, so that I could get that external validation. I could get sex, which, by the way, if you study physiology and again, through neuroscience, this is helpful for all of us, especially for anxious attachers. Sex is the fastest way for you to be able to receive emotional stimulation, because your body is actually secreting and creating hormones of oxytocin, of adrenaline, things that make you feel loved in that moment temporarily, so that your mind gives you a false sense of validation at that point. And for me, that was the fastest way to get a sense of validation, was, to have sex. So my habit was to unconsciously, even when I was with my friends, whatever, to look for the attention of these women. But why? Because I had a fear inside me that I wasn't fucking good enough. And at those moments when I sought that attention, I was never feeling completely secure. I was never truly happy with where I was, which, even if it was with my friends having a great time, there was always something I needed. And so it was the lack of self-acceptance that led to the need for external validation. So hitting this core point, for me, what changed my life drastically and helped me evolve a lot of my mechanisms was always going to the core point. Now, just to give you all the thought process, to work with your core wounds, you have to be able to not just battle your ego, you have to go into your subconscious mind. And so in the gauntlet, that's the entire journey of what the gauntlet's about. In week 2 specifically, we talk about the core wounds. What are the wounds deep inside of you that we can actually use the different processes to dance and jump past the ego, get into the subconscious, and actually work on those healings? Because here's the magical fucking answer. If you are able to heal and work with those wounds in there, your habits will change. Your mechanisms will stop. And so now, what I want to talk to you about this part, this section, where we're coming through, is how can I actually create or move into the more positive or hopeful habit structure and creation. Now, remember something that Brenton said, which was amazing, which was we need to move our focus or recreate and almost shift. Think of this concept of energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It has to just be shifted or moved from one form to the other. Matter the same, any of those principles of physics. The same is almost with habits. If you want to change a negative habit, you have to almost recreate a positive habit to take its place. But here's something you may not have known until today. What is the reason to change that habit? What should be the purpose of that new habit? You may not have realized, and someone may have just said, oh, you're late all the fucking time. Like, try and create a habit of being early. And you're like, well, how the fuck am I going to do that? Okay, I'm going to try and discipline myself just to do that. And if you don't remember what I said, if your belief is not strong enough, it will break down. And then your habit will not actually be formed. So action, multiple action leads to creating belief. And if you have strong belief multiple times, it'll lead to your habit. So now the question arises, okay, Yats, if I want to change this negative or dysfunctional habit into a positive functional one, what needs to be the area I work around? I want to pause and ask you all the question. What do you think is the key element here for this change from a dysfunctional habit to a functional habit. What is the key element here of change? You all know this. Every single one of you knows this. But I want you to see if you're aware about it at this moment. It is, remember, it's in the word. It's in the word coping mechanism. What is a coping mechanism? It's a mechanism to cope with something, right? So if I'm trying to change, and just as we talked about before, and Brenton brought up validly, I can't just X out a mechanism and say, be gone, Satan, you're out from my life, and then just ignore it. There has to be a mechanism that takes its place. So in both cases, I need something to healthily cope with something if I haven't healed those wounds yet. Healing the wounds is always the ultimate story, right? We talked about this. Healing the wounds is the ultimate story. And again, that's the principle of like intense programs of reparenting, subconscious work like a gauntlet. But if you're looking at the principle behind it in itself, you're taking my previous coping mechanism and you're replacing it with a more upgraded, evolved, more functional, more supportive coping mechanism. So now I'm taking a bad quote unquote habit and I'm trying to create a supportive quote unquote habit. But the key area here is focusing on the element that I still need to cope with. Because if you invalidate that coping, then you're going to break down this habit and you're going to go all the way back to that one because your ego thinks that previous habit is more successful. So a couple of things in here. Yes, the ego is an absolutely essential part, Cynthia, because your ego hates change. So if you're trying to change your fucking coping mechanism to get a new one, it'll be like, bro, why the fuck? Let's do the same thing. It works so well. Yeah. It's like, why do you want to change this shit? Like, why do you want to like be able to uproot this whole thing because you think you found like a better version or something that can help? There's no need. So it'll try and break you down there. But here's now the trick. The next trick is, so think about these as layers. Step number one needs to be, what is my trigger? What is my wound? What do I need to cope with? Okay. So that's why I asked you all for that question, because that is the most essential thing when it comes to habit creation, coping mechanisms, when it comes to your avoidant, anxious style, everything. Now, step number two, which is an extremely essential step of overall healing, is healing this wound, this thing that I need to cope with. That is the absolute. There's no doubt that that's the most important part. That's a process. It takes time. You can't just do it in a day. You can't just swallow like a fucking pill, take ayahuasca and be like, I'm healed. It doesn't work that way. It takes a process of reparenting because you're reworking or playing with the subconscious. But let's come back to this session about what I can do in the present moment. Step number one, identifying the thing to cope with. Step number two, okay, healing is most important. But okay, yes, what do I do while I'm healing? I'm going through the journey. Step number three becomes, what are the constructive ways that I can still use to cope with the same wound? And step number four becomes, how can I create a system, a structure, a discipline of using these constructive coping ways in a manner where I can do them multiple times, because step number five is beating the ego.
Hey, and welcome to the Inner Yats YouTube page. If you like our content, make sure you click the like and the subscribe button so that you get more of these amazing videos that keep coming your way.